Hello, I'm Marcus Louth and welcome to the Anomaly Project, The Breakdown, the show where we look back at our recent episode and explore some of the things mentioned that we didn't get a chance to talk about in full at the time. Now, myself and STEVE MERA recently spoke to paranormal researcher and investigator Malcolm Robinson. Now, as you might imagine, I recommend that you check out that interview in full because it's absolutely fascinating. And we covered some ground and delved into a wide range of topics, including poltergeists, portals, and alien abductions. Now, one of the things that came up that we didn't get a chance to speak about in full was time slips. These bizarre events where a person suddenly finds themselves propelled back in time in an instant and without warning. Now, before we explore this remarkable phenomenon further, let's remind ourselves of what Malcolm had to say about this.
And would we describe as a portal these sudden time slips? There's a famous one in Manchester where this chap goes into the shop and bang, it just reverted back to it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. And again, you ask, what is the mechanism between this? Now, admittedly, that's not necessarily a portal, it's a time slip. But is it part of the same agenda? Is it part of the sameness, you know?
Now, one place that is an apparent hotspot of these types of encounters is Bold Street in Liverpool. And one of the strangest of these occurred in 2006. According to an article in the Liverpool Echo, Sean, a self-confessed shoplifter, claimed he was running down Bold Street away from a security guard. Now, as he approached Brooks Alley, he felt a sudden tightness in his chest, and he had a sudden fear that he was having a heart attack. Now, suddenly, he noticed his surroundings had completely changed. And not only that, but the people around him, who were all going about their daily business, were all wearing old-fashioned clothing, perhaps several decades old. Now, he eventually saw a newspaper kiosk near Central Station, and he walked over and picked up a copy of the Daily Post. He was more than shocked when he looked at the date, which said May 18th, 1967. It was only now that he realised that all of the cars, of which there were a lot less incidentally, were all old-fashioned also. Now at this point, Sean turned and ran back the way he had just come, and moments later, the surroundings around him changed back to 2006. He turned around and bizarrely, he could see through a strange, invisible type window or doorway what appeared to be 1967. Now he was obviously unsettled by all this and he returned home, and he eventually sought out and spoke to a journalist about the bizarre encounter. Now, the journalist, incidentally, later stated that they interviewed Sean 4 separate times, and he never once changed his story. Even more intriguing, the journalist also claimed that he tracked down the security guard who was chasing Sean at the time. Now, he said that as he was running towards Brooks Alley, Sean simply vanished into thin air. Now, what could have possibly caused this remains unknown. Could it have been, as Malcolm offered, some kind of portal? Well, perhaps so, yes. If we recall that Sean could see 1967 from where he was standing in 2006, if only briefly, then we might assume that some kind of temporary portal existed there. As an afterthought to all this, we might ask what might have happened if Sean had not ran back towards 2006 when he did. Might the portal have closed, leaving him trapped decades in the past? Speculating, albeit wildly still, could this explain at least some of the many missing people each year? Now, remember, Bold Street in Liverpool is not the only location where these bizarre time-slip encounters occur. Perhaps one of the most famous time-slip cases is the Kelsley time-slip. Now, according to the account, in the autumn of 1957 in Suffolk, England, 3 young cadets, Michael Crowley, Ray Baker, and William Lang, were given simple instructions from their superior to use the coordinates they had been given to go to Kelsey and then report back to them. Now, the orienteering mission began normal enough. However, as they approached the village with the sound of church bells greeting them, things suddenly began to change. Now, the church bells became muffled and then the 3 boys couldn't hear them at all. And as they walked down the hill that led towards the village, they could see that it was completely devoid of life. It was completely silent. They also noticed that the trees around them that were a typical orange-brown colour of autumn only moments ago were now a vibrant green, as they would be in the middle of summer. And the 3 young men looked around them and they were suddenly aware that there was no signs of modern life anywhere at all. There were no cars parked anywhere on the roads and there were no phone lines overhead. The buildings themselves appeared particularly old, with a medieval appearance about them. Strangest of all though, the church tower, which they were all looking at only moments ago, was no longer there. At this point, the three young cadets approached one of the nearby buildings and peeked through the windows. Now, the building, which seemed to be abandoned, appeared to be some kind of butcher's shop, although there were no tables or counters anywhere to be seen. What they could see, though, were 2 or 3 oxen carcasses which had been partially skinned and were now green with age and seemingly mouldy. Shocked and beginning to realise that something truly strange was going on, the 3 young cadets walked over towards another nearby building. Now, this building appeared to be a house, although it also seemed to be empty and completely abandoned. They could see that the walls had been whitewashed and not a single piece of furniture could be seen anywhere. At this point, the 3 cadets began to back out of the village, deciding that they should report back to their superiors on what they had seen. Now, they made their way back up the hill and out to the village, and as they neared the top, they realised that they could hear the church bells once more. Even more bizarre, as they turned around to face the village the way they had just come, they could see the smoke now rising from chimneys of buildings that had been abandoned only moments earlier. Lang would later describe the experience like they had walked back in time, and that the entire village was a ghost village. Even more unsettling were Lang's claims that he experienced an overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression, and also a feeling of unfriendliness, as if he was being watched by unseen people. Now, given Lang's description, we might ask whether the boys had slipped into another dimension as opposed to another time. Ultimately, the cadet superiors dismissed the account, and it would be forgotten about for over a quarter of a century until the 1980s. Now, by this time, Lang and Crowley had settled down in Australia, and while Crowley didn't recall the incident in as much detail as Lang, they would speak of the encounter during a telephone conversation. In fact, it was at this point when Lang contacted Andrew Mackenzie, who was a member of the Society for Psychical Research. Now, Mackenzie would invite Lang and Crowley back to England in order to visit the village of Kelsey, which they ultimately accepted. Mackenzie concluded that the 2 young men were very credible, as were their claims. There were also several intriguing details in the accounts that could be backed up factually, at least to a degree. Perhaps the most compelling of these was the recollection of looking through the windows of what the boys described as a butcher's shop. Mackenzie's research revealed that the building was a private house in 1957 and was still at the time of his research, and it had stood continuously since around 1350. Even more intriguing though, records showed that in the late 18th century, the building had operated as a butcher's shop and continued to do so until 1905. Mackenzie, though, would state that the building had been associated with the butcher trade for centuries prior to the records of 1790, maybe as early as the mid-14th century. In fact, the mid-1300s to the early 1400s just might have been when, in time, the 3 cadets had actually found themselves, possibly just after the Black Death, which records show killed at least half of the population of Kelsey. At this point in time, the construction of the famous church in Kelsey had been halted due to the outbreak of the plague and remained unfinished until after 1481. Now, we might recall that the 3 witnesses claimed to no longer be able to see the church after entering the village. Could it really be possible that the 3 cadets somehow were transported hundreds of years into the past, perhaps somewhere between 1350 and 1480? Or could they have even been transported to another dimension, some kind of alternative timeline that didn't evolve beyond the medieval age? Now, this is another subject we will return to and explore in full in a future episode of the Anomaly Project, but it is worth our time exploring one more time-slip event, but one that would seem to not go into the past, but the future, and quite possibly, once more, to another dimension. Now, we should note, whereas the 2 previous encounters we have explored almost certainly happened, regardless of what they might have been, the origins of the following accounts are not so clear-cut. There appears to be 2 main theories as to where the account came from. The first highlights the time the account took place, the early 1970s, a time when there was a lot of crossover from the hippie movement of the previous decades. With this in mind, it is suggested by some that the account came from a group of students who had perhaps partied a little too hard and with substances they were perhaps not familiar with, and essentially hallucinated a bizarre but strange journey, or at least misremembered it. Or, some others believe the account is nothing more than urban legend, that eventually found widespread life on the internet. And regardless of the truth, the encounter is worth detailing here. Now, according to most versions of the account, in May 1972, 4 college students from Southern Utah University were driving one evening on a dark moonless night, making their way back to campus. Now, interestingly or not, the 4 students are named in the encounter as Jana North, who was driving, Carol Abbott, Lisa Rockford, and Bethany Gordon. Now, realising it was getting late and the housemaster would lock the dormitory doors, they decided to take a shortcut through the Gallianton Canyon. Now, their surroundings appeared normal as they progressed through the canyon, but by the time they reached the end of it, the scenery became much different. On either side of the road, instead of sagebrush and sand, there were now vast fields of grain and pine trees, and moreover, a full moon was now present in the skies overhead. Now, perplexed, they continued down the road, eventually seeing a neon sign in the distance. Now, as they got closer to this neon sign, they could see that it was some kind of diner, but the letters on the sign, they looked unlike any letters they had actually seen before, more like symbols. Now, at this point, Jana was about to bring the car to a stop outside the diner. As she was doing so, the other 3 girls, they spotted several strange men walking out of the building. Now, Lisa went to wind down her window in order to ask the men for directions, but before she could speak, she let out a terrified scream, and then she urged Jana to get them out of there as quickly as she could. Now, Jana did as she asked, and Lisa eventually blurted out that the men were not human, and when the girls looked back, these strange men were now in pursuit of their car. The girls later described the vehicles they rode as egg-shaped and appeared to have 3 wheels, 2 at the front and 1 at the back. Now, a moment later, the girls could hear a strong whirring sound, and the vehicles, it seemed, were getting closer. They likened them to the sound of an angry nest of hornets. These futuristic transporters had an extremely bright light on the front of them, and it was clear to Jana and the rest of the girls that they were getting closer by the second. She increased her speed and headed back toward the canyon, the strange men still behind them. Then, moments after re-entering the canyon, their surroundings changed around them. Gone were the grain fields and the full moon, and perhaps most importantly, gone were the strange men. Now, at this point, Jan lost control of the car temporarily and it left the road, eventually coming to a stop in the sand and sagebrush. Now in complete shock, the 4 girls remained in the locked car until sunrise, when they eventually ventured outside to inspect the vehicle. They discovered that 3 of the tyres were flat and 1 of the hubcaps was missing. Now, according to the tale, the 4 students flagged down a passing police patrol car driven by Trooper Vic Lundquist. He investigated the scene, and he too was completely perplexed to discover the tyre markers in the sagebrush that seemed to appear out of nowhere with no sign of them coming from the road. Moreover, there was no sign whatsoever of the missing hubcap. It was as if it had completely disappeared, or perhaps had been left in another realm. Now, just what happened that evening in 1972 remains a complete mystery, and we should note there appears to be no solid records of the student or the police officer involved, and no one has come forward to speak of the encounter in the years since, so we shall perhaps make of that what we will. Now, another intriguing field of interest that came up during our conversation with Malcolm Robinson was astral projection, the ability to leave the physical body. Now, here is Malcolm speaking a little bit about this.
The human mind, as we know, is an amazing organ. For God's sake, it's incredible, you know. And there's so many perplexities when we talk about the human brain and humankind. You know, when we dream, everybody dreams. Some people go astral traveling, some people go out of body. And so is that the soul that's leaving their body? Is that part of the mind or a separate entity called the soul? And I believe it is the soul. You know, people have this ability. Robert A. Monroe, for instance, did a lot of astral traveling and stuff. And that's a gift, for want of a better word. It's something that some people can do.
Now, you can't really talk about astral projection and not mention Ingo Swann. Swann took part in some remarkable CIA remote viewing experiments in the early 1970s, and the results were fascinating to say the least. One of these experiments saw him astral project to the planet Jupiter, where he revealed information that was still several years from being discovered by scientists. The experiment, of which there are official documents, took place in 1973 at Stanford University and also included the involvement of the NSA. According to the official timeline, The experiments began at 6 p.m. 3 minutes later, Swan announced that he was there, essentially right in front of Jupiter, the largest planet in our solar system. One of the details he offered was that there was a ring around Jupiter similar to Saturn. Years later, when the Pioneer 10 probe completed its flyby of the gas giant, it confirmed Swan's assertions that a ring was present around the planet. Now, Swan also took part in other more secretive experiments, including astral projecting to the moon, where he claimed he not only witnessed domed buildings, but large, intelligent, non-human entities. Now, if he was truthful and correct in his claims about Jupiter, might we expect the information about what he had witnessed on the lunar surface to also be correct? Now, while astral projection and remote viewing is something we will undoubtedly get into in much more detail in a future episode of the Anomaly Project, of interest to us here is how there could be connections between astral projection and the ability to leave the physical body and alien abduction. Now, here is Malcolm Robinson speaking a little about astral projection in alien abduction cases.
But when we look at what possibly these greys want, and I've been asked this a number of times, just getting back to your earlier question there, that perhaps these greys are looking to mankind for our soul, what makes us physically tick, what makes us, But again, that's speculation, because I've said many times before, it can't just be for allegedly reproducing a dying planet, taking sperm and ova from males and females. I've been doing that for nigh on 50, 60, 70 years. They've surely got enough genetic material. So what they're trying to achieve by these UFO abductions is maybe something different. There's a great case in, I think it was Australia, a lady called Maureen Puddy had been seeing a lot of UFOs, and these two Australian researchers jumped in the car with her, and she says, right, come on guys, I'm going to take you to this area where I see UFOs a lot, and who knows, I may go with them. Wow, this is great. So these two researchers sat in the back of the car. They stopped the car at this location, and Maureen Puddy went, they're coming. They're going to be here very, very soon. They're here. I'm going now. I'm going with them. She never went anywhere. She was sat in the front of the car. So getting back to my point is maybe they took the etheric body, the spiritual body. People talk about these abductions, switching off the husband and the wife gets taken. But maybe it's the physical, spiritual body that they're interested in. But we don't know for sure.
Now, the Puddy case is indeed intriguing, there is no doubt about that. There are, though, other cases of apparent alien abduction through what appears to be astral projection. On May 23rd, 1973, for example, just outside of Houston, Texas, Judy Dorati was driving home from an evening playing bingo. Now, with her were several other people, including her daughter, her mother, sister, and brother-in-law and sister-in-law. Now, suddenly they noticed a bizarre bright light overhead which appeared to be following their vehicle. Now, eventually, Judy pulled the car over to the side of the road and the passengers got out, and they were amazed to see a disc-shaped object hovering close by. Then, the object shot upwards and disappeared. Now, in the days that followed, Judy began to have intense nightmares, and when the other witnesses informed her that she had actually left the vehicle when the light began approaching them, something that she couldn't recall, she underwent hypnotic regression in order to recover her missing memories. Now, she ultimately described being enveloped in a strange light that she could not free herself from, before describing being in a strange room with strange figures all around her, figures whose description matched what we would recognise as grey aliens. The most intriguing detail to us here, though, is Judy's assertions that she was both standing by the car and on the craft at the same time, perhaps suggesting that she had left her physical body as part of the abduction. Now, if there is any legitimacy to the notion that at least some alien abductions are carried out by extracting the person's soul, essentially, could there even be somehow connected to reincarnation? We might remind ourselves of Whitney Strieber speaking of recycling of souls being somehow involved in alien abductions. It is perhaps interesting to note, for example, that many people who have out-of-body near-death experiences speak of a bright light that they are drawn towards. Now, is this the same bright light that many alien abductees speak of seeing during their respective encounters? As usual, there is plenty of otherworldly food for thought. Now, as we said earlier, we spoke a lot about poltergeist cases in our recent episode, One of the poltergeist cases we mentioned was the Soki poltergeist, and once more I'd like to recommend that you check out our episode with Malcolm Robinson in full to hear from Malcolm himself about that fascinating case. Another case that we mentioned a few times in passing was the Rochdale poltergeist that our very own Steve Mera investigated. Now, this phenomenon began unfolding in the summer of 1995, where a family claimed they were being driven from their home by intense paranormal activity. And these included much of the typical phenomena that you might expect: strange noises, objects moving and even disappearing. One of the strangest details of the encounter, though, was the sudden appearance of water that soaked the ceiling, walls and the carpet. Here is Steve speaking about this aspect of this most perplexing case.
In that Rochdale case, Stephen, was there not like rain or water travelling down from the ceiling? Is that right?
I thought I'd lost my mind when the gardener asked me to come in. Would you like a cup of tea? Because, oh yeah, of course, I'll have a cup of tea. So he shouts me from the kitchen, and I walked into the kitchen, and I could never forget the scene. It will never leave me alive. It was raining, and he was sat on this stool in the corner with an umbrella up. And he just had this funny smirk on his face to say, "Told you so." You know, and because it's hard, it's a big pill to swallow. But I looked up, and the whole ceiling is a shimmer. There's about, I'd say, probably about a centimetre of water just shimmering across the ceiling. But the rainfall from it was very big droplets. And I remember looking over, because he started making me a cup of tea, and he put the milk in, the milk first. And I remember a big droplet going in, and the milk jumped out. That's how big the droplet.
Oh, really? My God!
Honest to God. And then I was like watching it, and then suddenly I saw these patches on the ceiling, become areas where separation, and then it just kind of looked like, to be honest, it looked like it absorbed into the ceiling areas first, and then all of it, but gone. But everything around was absolutely soaking wet.
Wow.
Without a word, he just put down the brolly, got up, opened this cupboard. He's got like 3 or 4 different big, very different mops, wonder mops and all sorts of things, and just starts clearing it up. Not much to say about it. I think they got used to it. I'd never seen anything like it. I'd seen it traverse across the ceiling and move around the light switch. The loft hatch is right here. It's literally 2 feet away from this location where the water's on the ceiling. You can put your hand in, you can look around. It's absolutely bone dry, dusty. And at the time, there was a heat wave in the UK. It only happened very often, but it was a hosepipe ban on. There was no water coming in, and yet you look underneath, and there it is, and you think to yourself, "What the hell is going on here?" Now, to that, when that happened, Malcolm, I had no idea that there were other cases of water manifestation until afterwards. You know, and I started realizing, okay, you know, but the family were relocated eventually. It followed them for about 3 weeks and then stopped.
Yeah.
You know,
Now, as well as the bizarre appearance of water, the activity at the Rochdale property was particularly destructive. Objects would not only move and fly about of their own accord, but they were seemingly purposely aimed at inhabitants of the house. In fact, this violent presence even punched Steve Mera in the back during the investigation. Now here is Steve speaking about that.
In fact, it was the Rochdale Poltergeist case when I got hit in the back.
Uh-huh.
And I got, what was strange was, because I was learning as being an engineer at the time, and it lifted me off the bed onto like a small dressing table, and I don't know how I got there, but I was a big guy. I'm a big guy. It takes a thump in the back is not going to lift me off the bed.
Yeah.
It was a bit like an electric shock, which repelled you, you know, and a thump at the same time. And I did everything a professional investigator would do. I ran out the house. And I sat on the wall out there, and I said, my first words were that I'm out of the subject. That was the first thing I went. And because I couldn't wrap my head around it. I realized that maybe I got into it too far, out of depth, can't protect myself. I don't know what I'm dealing with. And it caught me off guard, you know. But hey.
Now, Steve also spoke about another member of the team being injured during the investigation. Let's remind ourselves about that also.
And then into the fourth area, which is physical interaction, which is they tend to prod you or pull your hair or scratch you, things like that in some cases. And one of the investigations I did, one of the girls got pushed down the stairs and she broke a leg.
Wow. Wow.
And the church, so sometimes it can be quite bad. And then you start getting the higher layer where it affects you psychologically.
Now, the destructive behaviour of the poltergeist continued, as you can see from some of these pictures here. Now, there was also some strange objects that materialised. Perhaps most interesting, a small statuette of the Greek goddess Themis, who seemingly represented justice. Where did this statue come from? Why? Perhaps most interesting of all, though, were the results of the tests carried out on the water that was leaking in the property against normal tap water. There were several differences discovered, including there were seemingly higher concentrates of calcium, sodium and chloride in the paranormal water compared to the tap water. It was, though, the electric content of the water that is perhaps of most interest to us. The tap water had a conductivity of 181. The paranormal water, on the other hand, had a conductivity of 1,323. Is this further proof of electromagnetic energy, however it might manifest, being a crucial aspect of the paranormal? That's spooky stuff, I'm sure you'd agree. Okay, so make sure you let us know your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to our channel and follow us on social media. And make sure you check out the Anomaly Project podcast.com for articles, news and updates. Until next time, goodbye and take care.